Welcome to episode 329 of the Defensive Security Podcast. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me today, as always, is Mr. Andrew Callett.
Good afternoon, Mr. Bell. I apologize if anything is different or weird. I'm on backup equipment because my main equipment is having a bad day.
But you know what? You had a DR plan, so like
I did.
Who could fault you for that?
This is also the third day in a row we've tried to record, and real life stuff keeps getting in the way. So I said, darn it, we're going to make it happen.
Yeah, although, one of those days was me just not wanting to come in from the beach. So.
But it was also your wedding anniversary, so that's I think acceptable. And you're running out of good beach days, so you gotta use them while you can.
That's true. It's I'm coming home on Sunday, but it's actually going to be like in the 30s on Monday here.
Wow,
crazy.
Yeah.
Anyhow, a quick reminder that the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are ours and not those of our employers or our customers. And also a deep, heartfelt thank you to our Patreon sponsors. I certainly appreciate you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. And by the way, if you do want to support the show, you will get your episodes, your weekly fix of DefSec a week early, which is pretty awesome if I do say so myself. You can sign up for the low price of, I guess whatever you want to pay at our Patreon site. It's patreon.com/defensivesec. And that's SEC, not the other one.
Right. That's a different show entirely.
A whole different show, which, we're working on that one. So anyway. Also, I will give our YouTube page a plug, although, we screwed up I screwed up last time, right? I did not check that the right option was checked to record video. So, but normally you can actually see our smiling faces for whatever that's worth on our YouTube page. It's just search for Defensive Podcasts on YouTube. You can see all of our stuff there. Get your mind out of the gutter, please. Thank you. But we do, we do really appreciate everybody who has responded to our call for followers on YouTube. Sincerely appreciate you. Thank you very much.
Absolutely. We're catching up with you, Rogan. We're coming for you.
That's right. We only have 4 million followers to go, and then we'll be caught up.
At least, because I think he's got a lot more.
You got to start. You got to start somewhere.
That's fair. Never mind. This podcast is 15 years old.
Yeah. Hey, that's a badge of honor.
That's true.
So it's a feature, not a bug. So anyway, I have the curtain closed because the sun is super low on the horizon. If I were to open that curtain, you wouldn't see anything except sunlight. So that's why I have this ugly background behind me. Okay, so let us get into some stories. The first one comes from the Register, and the title here is MIT Sloan quietly shelves AI ransomware study after researcher calls BS.
Boy, was this a hot topic on your Mastodon server.
This is juicy. And by the way, it is still, it's still reverberating on LinkedIn and on TikTok, and it's kind of died out on Mastodon, but it was quite the rage. So there was as you might surmise from the title of the story, there was a report published by MIT. It was actually much earlier this year, so it's been out for quite some time, which was a joint venture between a security company and some MIT people. Not just anybody in MIT. I think it was a fairly prominent person, as I recall, that effectively said that 80% or almost 81% of the 2,800 ransomware incidents they investigated were in some way leveraging AI. And
Wasn't that in 2024 as well? They investigated in
yeah,
2020. Yeah.
I think they their time horizon was like sometime in 2023 up until like end of 2024. I forget the exact
But
timeline,
the
but
point is
it's
not like recent, not like immediately preceding the last couple of months. This is like last year. So
yes. So Kevin Beaumont, I think, was at least the first one that I'm aware of that really started kind of throwing the flag out on the field, saying, this is not right. And I know that that malware tech Marcus had also called cried a foul because they apparently also included WannaCry, which Marcus is well known for having helped stop, as one of the AI ransomware strains, which is both not ransomware and also not AI, and also
right.
not during the time frame that they were allegedly analyzing. So what's I think problematic in all of this, it's not entirely an academic exercise to cry foul on this. Look, we've talked about this a lot, right? The news sources that we have to kind of calibrate our security programs are few, and a lot of times they're very heavily skewed towards what marketing departments of security companies want to publish. And so when you see something like this that comes from what appears to be a independent organization like that, I think in a lot of people's minds carries some weight. And if you're a CISO trying to trying to decide what you should be focusing your program on, and you read something like this, or your CFO or your CEO reads stuff like this, it can be a distraction. Like, what are you doing? What are you doing about this AI ransomware, Jerry? And,
Fix it.
and
Fix it now.
like you gotta and of course you've got your customers are sending you vendor spreadsheets, right, to figure out how you're countering the AI ransomware threat. So um, I think it is a good reminder that we were always you'll never go wrong being skeptical and doing trying to apply a little bit of critical thinking to this stuff. And I'm sure, by the way, at some point we covered some story that was in some way derived from this report without actually realizing it. So
Yeah.
this was a very heavily cited, as I understand it, very heavily cited bit of research that has like unceremoniously been retracted or at least like disappeared from their site.
Yeah, it was very quietly retracted without much sort of mea culpa. It was just sort of like, oh yeah, we've gotten some feedback. We're working on it. There will be a new version soon. But I agree with you. Like immediately to me, this didn't pass the smell test. But you and I have talked about the rise of AI and how it could be used in various types of attacks, whether it's social engineering or we've seen a little bit of malware and ransomware doing a little bit of generative AI engagement. But to say 80% were AI driven is just very bombastic. And I don't quite understand how they even got there. And it reminds me a little bit of, Forbes as a website used to be this well respected, I guess you could say well respected, but news outlet. It was a formal news outlet. Well, now just about anybody can publish anything they want on Forbes. It's like a medium.com, it's like a blog site.
Mm-hmm.
But you see people using that publish in Forbes.com as this badge of credibility without realizing that Forbes has changed into this near free for all blog site. And it sort of reminded me of like, MIT, what are you doing? Like, you're going to destroy your credibility with stuff like this. And I don't know who funded it or who drove this, but it sure feels like, it smells like and looks like some sort of company selling AI ransomware defense drove this. I don't know that to be true, but this is what this feels like to me, is that kind of nonsense to sell some blinky box.
Yeah, certainly has that feel about it. But look, I, I, I don't want to downplay what we're likely to see going forward as it pertains to AI enabled attacks. Like I have a strong suspicion that a lot of phishing lures that are sent in email are now the product of LLMs. Like why would you spend the time writing your own phishing lures if you can have a chatbot do it? Like so I think
Yeah,
you know
especially if you're not a native American speaker or native
right,
English speaker.
exactly. So and I as we've talked about in the past, we have seen some relatively small amount of malware that's been written by AI, and also malware that has makes calls into AI engines to help propagate or further its infection or what have you. But having said that, look, it doesn't take a rock scientist or an MIT person to look across the industry and see like the amount of developers being displaced and replaced by agentic AI development, products is happening at a pretty breakneck pace. And so like it isn't going to be long before, that this is a problem. But,
Yeah,
and I guess the other question I would have is like, so what? Right. So
that's an interesting question. Like, how do you change your defenses? What would you do differently?
yeah. So, okay. Let's say 5 years on from now, somebody publishes a report and like, it genuinely is the situation where 80% of the ransomware in that year was, or whatever the malware of the of the time uh, is the product of AI. Like, so what? Does that change how you are going to defend yourself? And I'm not sure it's going to be the impetus to drive the change. No, maybe AI enabled attacks evolve in a way that necessitates a different approach. Like there's lots of big thinkers that will talk about how, and I think we've covered this in a story recently about how on some timeline we're going to see AI becoming a much more prominent feature of security defense. Whether it's like AI operating a firewall. I'm being overly simplistic and bombastic there, but or just correlating events in new and novel ways to detect patterns that a person really wouldn't be able to see. So, um, I don't know. At this point, I don't know how you would act differently if it were actually 80%. And so I'm only left with like this. Inevitably, I feel quite certain, as you pointed out, was like the the intention was ultimately probably to sell something.
I mean, what you do is you tell your board you're buying the ransomware defense tool for AI ransomware, which I'm sure has many VCs lining up to fund as we speak.
Oh, 100%, 100%. But so I do say on the one hand, so what? But on the other hand, I would also say I think we have to keep an eye on what's happening in the threat landscape, because at some point AI will become a more AI will start to drive. I'll say it differently, right? AI is going to start to drive changes in how these attacks work,
Sure.
and
Yeah.
we'll have to respond. But I don't think that's the case, really at the moment. Other than we're seeing like phishing lures again being much more succinct and much more like hard to distinguish, because they're not written in sloppy English anymore and stuff like that. So,
Right.
um,
If I had to predict, I would say probably the first thing you'd see is some sort of AI code tooling that's assist with writing malware, right? And just speeding up their development cycle, like every other dev shop is experimenting with right now. But this sort of implies this agentic AI adversary coming for your systems, and we're not there yet. And I think that the point that I take away from the story, and I think you made this earlier, is be careful what you believe, be careful what you read, be careful what you react to. Because if you're reacting to this, you have a finite amount of budget and time and focus. You may not be reacting to something more important, like the basics that aren't getting done properly because you're chasing this new shiny that a board member read about because MIT said
mm-hmm.
it.
Yeah, well, exactly, because that I have a very strong feeling that's going to drive corporate executives, maybe not the CISO, right? Maybe not the security team, but it's going to drive corporate executives to want to purchase the thing that they saw on CNBC, advertised on CNBC, that is intended to help stop AI enabled ransomware or what have you. When in fact, what you really need to be doing is kind of the basic block and tackling that will either stop or mitigate the effects of ransomware, whether it's AI enabled or not. So like
Yeah.
I just think we, as you pointed out, like we've got to stay focused on what are we trying to accomplish. We have a fixed amount of time, fixed amount of money, fixed amount of resources, and we have to apply those in the most effective way possible and not get distracted by the bullshit that keeps coming out of the AI engine. That's what I have to
I
say.
concur.
All right, moving on. Also from the Register, the title here is EY exposes 4 terabyte plus SQL database to the open internet for who knows how long. It's been a long time since we had a good open storage bucket incident like this.
What's 4 terabyte of SQL data? Come on.
So it was apparently detected by a security researcher, a research company. They found that among the contents of this 4 terabytes were API keys, cached authentication tokens, session tokens, service account passwords, and user credentials. So, I mean, like, maybe kind of important stuff, I guess. I mean, it's probably not a big deal.
Look, information wants to be free.
It does. I can tell you, like, this is kind of like we were talking about just a minute ago. Like, the basics still matter. This is still a problem. I think that in large measure, Amazon and some of the other cloud providers have helped a little bit, because now you have to take they provision these buckets in a way that is kind of defaults to safe rather than default to open like they were previously. But that's not to say that you can't just open it back up. And in my experience, that happens a lot. And one of the organizations I work with has they call it the bucket challenge. You actually follow them on my Mastodon server. Their shtick is finding open buckets that contain sensitive information, and like I've actually helped them try to track down some of them, and it is really hard. There are so many, and companies are in such denial about this. It's a big
It's huge.
problem.
like I've run into at a previous employer, we knew we owned a cloud asset, but couldn't get the cloud provider to agree with us that we owned it and give us access or identify who did own it. Like it was this mess of like, yeah, it's in AWS or GCP or whatever, but if you don't already have access, they are not going to tell you. They're not going to work with you. They're just like, not our problem. Sorry. And then you're just in this. I had one situation a couple of jobs ago where we just had to basically just hope that whatever that thing was would eventually just break and go away because nobody had, all the people had access were gone. We had no way to get back into it. And the cloud providers were like, not a problem. Sorry. Have a nice day.
Yeah, I mean, they don't want to. They don't want to be, handing the keys to somebody else's bucket to an unauthorized party. They don't They don't have an easy way to tell.
I recognize that, and I respect that. In fact, we have another article in the story stack for today about sort of like zombie projects, but it's like, okay, what if like my corporate counsel comes to your corporate office and proves it? Like, is there any way?
So there's got to be a way, I have to imagine that it's probably a boring legal maneuver like DMCA or copyright infringement or some baloney like that you'd end up having to assert.
Not just sending something on company letterhead.
Probably not. Probably not. But look, this is one of those situations where the devil's in the details. It can be difficult to tell that you've made a mistake. And if you have people who aren't sophisticated in understanding how these access policies work, you can end up with a problem like this. This is super common and it's still happening. Like we don't talk about it a lot. And I think part of the reason we don't talk about it a lot is because it's just like become background radiation. But certainly they're not all created equal. And like in this instance, it's just an absolute mountain of data. And, your regulators aren't going to really care, right? Like you still have to, you have to disclose the breach and be prepared to weather whatever storm comes your way. So
I do feel like we're still dealing with this concept that a lot of whether they know or not, I think it's like in our DNA, developers feeling safe. They're behind the corporate firewall, and it's okay. Somebody's keeping them safe. When that just doesn't exist anymore, they're out in the raw all the time on these cloud providers, and they don't realize how easy it is to just go fully accessible with one misconfiguration, 1 minute. And I don't know that we've like accepted that as an industry that we in security have, but I don't think IT realizes how much power they have and how much they can hurt themselves if they click the wrong button. Maybe they have, and maybe this is just a mistake, but it does feel like in the early days that you and I started in, it was a lot harder to make a mistake like this because it was a lot harder to get public without working through a lot of other teams. And now it's trivial. And there's this concept of this firewall around a moat around your environment. Your environment can be anywhere on the internet. Everything's a SaaS provider now. And it scares me that we've democratized these security decisions to folks who probably don't realize that they have this much security impact. And I'm not saying they're malicious. I'm saying it's not their skill set.
Yeah. And I mean, look, this is one of the value propositions of cloud, right? Was, I mean, look at, if you rewind the tape back 15 years ago, the problem that a lot of companies had was that the IT department was kind of impeding progress. And so we ended up having, the advent of shadow IT, because business, people in the business were slapping on their credit card and standing crap up in the cloud. And like in the interceding years, most, many, I will say most, many organizations have moved their IT infrastructure into the cloud. But I also think that it's become pretty commonplace for companies to kind of book the savings with with that move, and not, it's not necessarily completely an irrational approach, but at the same time we have to be cognizant that this requires perhaps a level of care that developers historically have not had to demonstrate in the past, like you said.
Yeah, yeah, it's funny. There's a little side story in here. This is not the same bucket, but uh, one of the things that the Neo Security, who's quoting this, said this case was reminiscent of a similar breach they saw years ago when investigating the ransomware case. In that case, one of the engineers who was working on a database migration set a bucket public for just 5 minutes to do a migration, and then made it private again. But in that 5 minutes, it was long enough for an automated attacker scan to find it and download the files.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's another indicator of just how rapidly these things can be found by bad actors. And so that tells me you can't rely on, well, nobody will notice, it'll be fine. You almost have to assume if it's public, it's going to get picked up by a scanner almost immediately, and assume that everything is leaked.
Yeah, I think that's one of the fundamental misconceptions I think a lot of IT people have, especially. I don't know if this is concentrated in the older generation or in the younger generation. I haven't figured that out yet, but there is this notion that we're not a target. We just kind of blending into the background. But that's not how modern attacks work. Like at one point in the past, adversaries actually had to want to get to you, but nowadays a lot of this stuff is, especially when it's an attack against infrastructure connected to the internet, a lot of it is completely automated targeting by relatively automated, I'm not going to say AI, I mean a lot of it's just scripted, looking, trolling Census and Shodan and other sites, looking for exposed stuff that can be exploited, and a lot of the stuff just happens automatically. And we saw this, I saw this in spades when I was at the cloud provider. Like it just happens. And so I don't think anybody should be operating on the assumption that they just because they're not like strategically important or have nuclear secrets that they're not going to be a target, because that's not how this works anymore.
Right. Agreed.
And now we'll move on to the story that you gave some foreboding on. This is from darkreading.com, and the title here is Zombie Projects Rise Again to Undermine Security.
A perfect near Halloween story.
Yeah, this one hurt. Like all throughout my career, I struggle with this, and I suspect everybody has in the security world has stories about this. But they poke at it in different ways than I think a lot of typical discussions. Like the concept here is, unsurprisingly, we have stuff that gets abandoned. And that stuff can be open source repositories. That stuff can be, WordPress servers. That stuff can be, all manner of different things. They point out, and I still don't think this is the case, but I'm going to ride with it. They point out the Oracle. There was the big Oracle hack from, I don't know, was it a year ago or so, that they allege was a decommissioned server that wasn't fully decommissioned and had an unpatched critical vulnerability that was exploited. And
You
so
don't believe Oracle? You think Oracle would lie to us?
I'm not
Heresy.
going to say they're lying. I'm going to say that they are taking some liberties with the truth.
They have alternative facts.
Yes, alternative facts is a good way of saying it. Yes, that's right. It's a fake news. I think is what the kids call it these days.
That's true.
So,
That's true.
anyhow, S3 abandoned S3 buckets, as you pointed out. Like this is I think maybe we need to come up with an IT term of like IT litter, right? It's abandonware that comes in many forms. There are some stats they cite in here. Some of them I have some problems with. One of them is that they refer to this Ivanti report, which I find a little funny. I don't know why. You can think about it. I'm sure you'll come up with why I find it funny. But they say that about 51% of organizations run software beyond end of life. And the reason I think that is not true is because I have to believe it's closer to 100%.
Yeah, I would agree. These are the ones who are willing to admit it.
Right.
End of life is such a tricky thing too. How do you define it? How many people are running if they're doing if they're a software shop, how many dependencies they're pulling in that are technically end of life, but have no end of life stated policy? Or like, how do you define it? There's a lot of stuff that has no life cycle management stated around it. End of life is a really tricky one that I've struggled with in various roles. So I agree with you. I'm sure it's closer to 100.
There's certainly more obvious circumstances than others. Like if you're running a commercial piece of software, a great example that I think a lot of organizations are struggling with right now is VMware, because VMware recently changed its licensing terms to be like pretty breathtakingly expensive, I'll say. And one of the implications there is past a certain point you can't apply any security updates, and to the point where they will audit you, and if they see you're running security fix, my understanding at least is that they'll slap you with some licensing fees. And so that's an instance where you are potentially knowingly or maybe unknowingly running end of life stuff. And I've in my experience, one of the more common problems were end of life firewalls, where my experience was almost every one of the ransomware attacks on suppliers we saw was the result of end of life Cisco, SonicWall, name your firewall provider that had some remote code execution vulnerability, because like everybody exposes the control panel, the management interface to the internet because why not, right? And that's how the bad guys get in every single one of those cases. And I don't know the psychology behind that in every instance, but I have this feeling that like it's a security appliance. Like it, I don't need to pay for maintenance on this thing. It's a firewall. It should just
if it's
just block
not
things.
broke, don't fix it. It's fine.
Right.
It's fine. It works. It's worked for years. And by the way, there is an interesting argument around this, right? Why is everything a subscription? Why can't I just buy it once and use it? And there's certainly that feeling out there, and there's a lot of folks who are frustrated by the subscriptionization of hardware. When I've already invested in it once, I don't want to keep buying new pieces of software or licensing. But the flip side is, and I see this from a vendor's perspective, they can't support every version forever. That's not how software works. It gets prohibitively prohibitive. It gets very expensive to try to support every version. And look at Microsoft or Mac OS, Windows or Mac OS as an example. They have certain versions they support because that's where their emphasis of their development time and their bug fixes and their security scans go. And I get that from a software shop perspective. But I also understand why people get frustrated, why they feel like they're constantly pushed into buying updates or buying new hardware in this forced obsolescence model that we've gotten ourselves into. So it's an interesting trap. I don't know that I have a good solution, but I just want to acknowledge that that's a very real frustration of IT shops everywhere.
Percent. It's a huge part of the average company's IT budget. No doubt about it. But that, by the way, is not to say that open source is not also a problem. And they point out also in this article, this is some stats from Black Duck, that 9 in 10 code bases that were scanned have open source components that are more than 10 versions behind the current release.
Yeah.
And about the same number have packages that showed no development activity over the past 2 years. And that, I think, goes back to a point that you made a couple minutes ago. And that is, like, it's, kind of Schrodinger's support model. Like, you don't know if it's, like, is it abandoned or are there just no updates?
Right. And what do you do, or what is your policy to assume that some open source dependency library hasn't been updated in X amount of time? Do you consider it abandoned and find an alternative? And just to say out loud, the concern is if you're running something abandoned, there's no security fixes, there's no updates. You may get some scope creep in terms of, not scope creep, but creeping away from being able to be compatible with other things. And then, the other problem that I see with this is those that are running components that are 10 versions out of date, and I think this also applies to things that are abandoned, is when it comes time to update, it's very, very, very disruptive. You've got now a bunch of third order effects. I almost want to use the word dependencies again, which is somewhat misleading here, but you've got multiple things that now have to change to get this one update, as opposed to if you took the incremental steps time over time over time. It's a small amount of pain and you can handle it versus one big disruptive change. That's a lot of pain all at once. So, but boy, do I see this all the time where devs just don't want to spend the time or can't spend the time on keeping third-party dependencies up to date, because also updating it may change something. They've got to change their code and it could break some other stuff. And there's a risk to change. There's a production risk to change. We see that. So there's these two things are at odds and at tension. I feel like I'm kind of rambling around my point here, but I think this is a very real problem. And the way I've tried to approach this as best I can with dev shops I've worked with is say, hey, try to be within n-1 of a major version of whatever it is. You don't have to be bleeding edge. You don't have to update every time, but n-1 of the major version. And I think 2 years is a good cutoff. If you haven't seen a development update of a package in 2 years, take a long, hard look at it. See if it's considered abandoned.
But that also,
I think it's fair.
I mean, that requires you to have a capability to keep an eye on that, and that is,
yeah, that's true. And what about the packages you don't control, like that are bundled in, that are downstream? Yeah,
right. This is a really complicated problem, and I think this is why we're starting to see more and more tools like Black Duck and SNCC and others, finding an increasingly important place in this ecosystem, because, and I'm not saying, by the way, that they have this problem nailed. Like, I don't know that those providers have in all cases, I'm sure they do in some cases, to detect that some popular piece of open source software has effectively been abandoned. And I also, I'll go on and tag on to something you said a couple minutes ago. the time that you find out that you have to make an update is probably going to be when there's a critical vulnerability found in something. And if it's really far out of date, the amount of pain that you're going to go through to try to either rip something out that's no longer under support and will not be supported anymore, or to to have to refactor. Like one of the back when I feel like I'm getting to be one of those old people. Back when I was young, um, one of the most problematic pieces of software we had was Kubernetes, which is kind of funny. And it's it's maybe a dull example, but the Kubernetes release cycle is very aggressive, and they do not provide official support. At least this was the case a year and a half or 2 years ago, for more than a version or two back. And so like you have to stay on the treadmill, and they have vulnerabilities somewhat often. And there's usually, not always, there's often breaking changes that require that require some amount of intervention that's not always trivial, for the workloads that are running inside the kube cluster. So that's I think a good example. Now Kubernetes, I think this is not at risk of being abandoned, but you get
Right.
you get the point, hopefully, right?
So Kubernetes is kind of like the honey badger of the DevOps world. Honey badger don't care. DevOps
don't care.
Kubernetes don't care. Upgrade.
The next version's coming. Don't care.
Upgrade your stuff. We broke old stuff. Don't care.
Get on it. Let's see what else. They found that most code bases have at least one package that's more than 4 years out of date, which is amazing. And then the vast majority of what they call zombie code bases contain at least one critical vulnerability, which obviously was a big problem. But we've talked about this before. Like when you whatever you're using, whether it's open source or commercial, like you're adopting it, you're taking responsibility for it. And in the case of commercial software, you have contracts in place that govern the a requirement for them to patch vulnerabilities and whatnot, or at least you should. But you don't have that in open source, and there's really no guarantee that any vulnerability will ever get fixed, and that's a big problem. And we've seen, by the way, some. I think it was curl was one of the ones where the maintainers of curl were just getting super pissed about the amount of what they've deemed like AI slap vulnerability reports, where somebody runs some AI code scanner, and it burps out a bunch of stuff which is actually not a problem, and that just clutters up a team who's already overloaded. Like it's a volunteer team who's already got enough to do, and now they have to cut through the crap on this. So like this problem, I think, is trending in the wrong direction on many dimensions.
Much like my waistline.
We can all appreciate that. Now there was something that they brought in here which I wanted to talk about, because I don't think enough people talk about that, and that is APIs as like an asset, right? And I don't know that a lot of companies actually have this problem. This was a huge problem when I was, at the cloud, and as you might imagine, a cloud provider has huge numbers of API endpoints. Like it's behind, a central API, but has lots and lots of calls that you can make. And well, logically, you would think, well, somebody has to own, like there's somebody responsible at the end of the day for every one of those things, and keeping tabs on that at scale is really hard, and so we struggle with asset management generally, like you keeping tabs on who's responsible for what server and what application is a big problem, but like that extends to APIs, and they point out in here that like that is a problem because a lot of times companies will, rightly so, they'll upgrade APIs, there'll be new formats and whatnot, but they'll keep the old ones in place for backward compatibility for some period of time. And if they don't get shut off, like they just become zombies, and eventually they may themselves have vulnerabilities and then become exploited. So that's a big problem. I think broadly speaking, the problem of attributing assets to active business owners is a problem, whether it's a WordPress site, whether it's a firewall, server, an API endpoint. I think is a really big problem that we generally haven't really, as an industry, solved broadly.
Yeah, I agree. This plays in the world of asset management. This plays in the world of like, attack service management. There's a lot of stuff here, and it's a very vexing problem. I have somewhat taken the approach in my recent roles of somebody, and by, when I say somebody, I usually mean an executive sponsor and a business unit has to have positive control over an asset, which means they're doing positive care and feeding, or I'm taking it away. I'm shutting it down. If nobody's willing to raise their hand and say, yes, I will take care of that. Yes, I'm responsible for that. Versus, we're not sure, but don't touch it. No. Like, they talk about AI as another one where people just set up things and they forget about it or they move on. Seeing this a lot where, OpenAI projects, somebody will spin up some Azure instance in OpenAI when that was the only option, and then they leave the company or something. And if there's nobody willing to raise their hand, I'm going to shut it down as just a security issue. But I think a lot of companies are afraid to do that. They're afraid to just turn things off if nobody knows what it is and see who screams. And I really do think we have to get back to this concept of there needs to be an executive sponsor for a piece of technology or it goes away. And and not just a sponsor, but one who understands all the care and feeding and responsibilities that comes from owning that technology.
I think that's one of those things where if that's endemic in your culture, where if something becomes abandoned, it's going to get shut off. I think it's eminently sensible. Like it's hard to argue against it. In fact, I think where it becomes a big problem is when you've got a company or an organization that hasn't had that discipline, and suddenly you're trying to get your arms around what's going on and implement a policy like that. That's where I think you end up with a lot of pushback, but it's short-term pain, and it's pain on your own schedule with a manageable impact and blast radius. Whereas if you don't get your arms around it, it could result in a breach, and we all know how bad that can get.
The last thing I'll say on this, and then I'll move on, is I think one of the real problems that we haven't touched on is knowing these things even exist. If you're in charge of security or technology for an organization, the first problem is knowing they're out there. There's so many ways somebody could stand something up that's not under your purview, you have no idea about. And that's the first problem, especially if there's no visible component.
100%. That was one of the most fascinating things in pretty much everywhere I've ever worked, was getting your arms around that. Now, where I used to work, we had a very effective internal audit function. It was a big public company, and they tried to act responsibly, and so they had a pretty mature internal audit capability. And one of the areas that audit function really hammered on was asset management. And they had a very methodical approach. Like they would come at it from a bunch of different ways. They would look at, for example, they would look at, tell me everywhere that you have an EDR agent running. And then they, give me your list, give me the list of of all your assets. And then they would, give me all of your log sources. And then, and they would, they would kind of come at it from like 10 different ways, like show me, flows of, the applications that your users interact with. And anyway, they would kind of put this all into a blender and come up with likely things that were not being managed. And God damn it, they were good at their job.
Yeah.
But it took something like that to to shine a light into the dark corners to find where all those cockroaches were. We were always better for it because it's such a hard problem. I do think, by the way, that if you are responsibly using cloud, I think that there are big advantages because it's your cloud console is a pretty good and authoritative source of asset inventory. I mean, with an asterisk at the end of it, but it's when you don't have management of all the cloud services that your people are using, that's when you get into trouble too.
Yeah. Yeah. Or they're off on their own, doing their own thing. It's not under your main subscription.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yep.
All right. The last story for today, and this is somewhat timely, I guess, is also from Dark Reading. The title here is Cloud Outages Highlight the Need for Resilient, Secure Infrastructure Recovery. So within
this article frustrated me, but go on.
Within the span, I like these articles because they kind of prompt a discussion, not necessarily for the content. But there were two major cloud outages within like 2 weeks. We had AWS was out for almost 2 days, and then Azure had a big outage as well. And they have different levels of impact. Like with AWS, a lot of services that we, kind of independent web services that we rely on, like Netflix and Reddit and whatnot, were broken, as well as some retailers. But on the Azure side, it's like, your Office 365 and Teams and all that stuff goes down. So this is something that in my experience, one of the things I used to work on was supporting really heavily regulated customers, and in particular, banking customers. And so I worked a lot with bank regulators globally. And one of the big concerns they had was this concept of concentration risk. And so as a cloud provider, they looked at us as a source of concentration risk. Like, if you have too many banks on your cloud and your cloud goes down, like then that can cause a problem to the overall financial system. And so, what are we going to do about that? But it extends beyond that into areas that are maybe not obvious. And so, for example, if let's hypothetically say, you're using CrowdStrike as an EDR platform, and you're using, I don't know, Rapid7 as your SIM provider, and both of them are on AWS. And by the way, I don't know that they are. And so I'm just hypothetically saying both of them are on AWS. Sure. And AWS goes down. Now, like, you're completely in the dark. And so, understanding the level of dependency across your kind of key controls on single points of failure like that is important, especially in certain like really sensitive industries like like banking. And I think we saw some of this coming out as frustrations in especially in the AWS outage. Like there were lots of lots of cascading failures, I guess is the way I'll describe it, coming out of that.
Yeah, it was also, I think what frustrated me about it, I agree with your point. Like, you need to understand that. And then, by the way, once you understand it, you can make a rational business decision about what you want to do about it, if anything.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what frustrated me is there was a lot of pontification about how you should just make sure you have multi-cloud going, and you should build so you're not so dependent on US East 1 going down. And that's really easy to say from someone sitting in a ivory tower who's never built a complex environment. It's really expensive and difficult for a business to do. And to your point, knowing what your suppliers are, maybe you can ask, but what frustrated me a little bit is, and maybe this is a little game theory, that AWS, GCP, whomever, Azure, that they know that their uptime is critical. And yeah, they make some mistakes, but they're going to self-correct. I don't know if it makes a lot of sense for most businesses most of the time to worry that much about this, because I think it's a rare event. And I think for most businesses to defend against it, to build enough resilience against it, is super expensive, super complex, and probably not worth it. And it's probably worth the risk for a 10-hour outage once every X number of months to save the money on the infrastructure and staffing to build multi-cloud resilience and all the problems that come with it. Now, I think a business needs to make that determination. To your point, like a bank or whatnot, or something that has critical uptime. But your chatbot can go down and your life isn't going to end, guys. Like your grammar assistant can go down for 10 hours and your life isn't going to end. And then there was all these sort of like clickbaity articles about, oh, my cloud connected bed was inoperable, and all these things that grabbed all these headlines. I'm like, cool, but it's a fairly rare event. Do we need to throw the baby out with the bathwater? And I'm not trying to defend it. I'm trying to say that there's a reasonable business case. And if you are a security guy walking in the door saying, oh my God, we need to be multi-cloud, this isn't acceptable, and then the business guy goes, cool, okay, how much is that going to cost me? So it's going to be 2x my current cost. And what's my likely downtime is 1/3 of the 2x cost, and that's only going to happen once every couple of years. Get out of here. You don't understand business. And don't come.
It's not going to be. It's not going to be 2x the cost. It's going to be like 2.5x the cost, because you've got to create your application and workloads in a way that it abstracts away the cloud, which is not always trivial.
Very true. Very true. So, plus all the extra time it takes you're going to slow down everything else, right? There's an implicit cost of doing this in terms of testing and reliability, DR, failover, like all these things you now have to worry about, which maybe you're doing anyway, but now it's multi-cloud. So you've got to have multiple skill sets or multi-region. I guess my point is that the people who pontificate about this typically don't understand the business decision behind something like this. And you could be completely right that you're dependent on this, and completely wrong that it's worth the cost to not be. And you're now the problem in the room, which makes security folks look dumb to business people. And that's my frustration on this conversation. And I know I'm ranting a bit.
It comes down to the level of sensitivity each business has. I mean, some businesses are, they're not going to be willing for their e-beds to ever go down, and so like they're going to want their infrastructure to be split across regions or what have you. But that's, as you mentioned, like that's for each individual business to decide, because it has non-trivial cost implications. It is it can be stupid expensive, if it's even feasible to do at all. Now, I will put a like an asterisk at the end of this and say, like, we saw in South Korea, and I think you sent this to me about 2 or 3 weeks ago. Like, there was a data center, cloud data center, burned to the ground, and so that's not to say like you shouldn't be thinking about disaster recovery, because US East 1 could burn down. Like, it's probably very unlikely, but it could burn down. Probably won't. But if it did, like, you should have a backup plan. Not that you should have like mirror infrastructure in some other region, but like an ability to recover your data, just like, any other DR plan, right?
Sure.
So I just want to make that.
And,
This was something that I ran into this a lot, at the cloud provider, because customers think cloud is magical.
Right. And I think that's my frustration, is all these folks who were thought leading on this topic saying, you're an idiot if you can't build around this, as opposed to, you don't understand how expensive that is. And yeah, it's doable, but it's a matter of money, not a matter of intelligence or will. And I don't think that that's understood by folks who are used to running their home lab in their basement and not multinational Fortune 500 companies.
I think a lot of CEOs and CFOs would say, like, I'd rather spend that extra money on more developers or more salespeople, or stock buybacks.
And there's a formal discipline, by the way, to make that decision based on likelihood, impact, cost to mitigate. Like, this isn't flippant, just like, oh, you're dumb because you didn't know. There's like, this is a problem that can be solved, but it is expensive, and every cost means an opportunity cost against something else, to your point you just said. So I got frustrated by the thought leadership around this topic.
I think where you're going is, it's not really an IT decision. It's a business decision. The business needs to decide what its level of sensitivity and need for availability and uptime is, and be willing to pay for it or not. And if not, then like, you have to be, you have, and you're tacitly accepting.
And as a consumer, right? Let's say you're an eBed consumer. Are you willing to pay 2x for a resilient multi-cloud managed bed? Because that's the real world. At the end of the day, these things will be more expensive to the consumer or the other business that's buying it. So that
what I want to know is, did all the owners of those connected beds send vendor spreadsheets to the bed? Like, does the bed manufacturer have a SOC too? I just have all these questions now.
They're probably kind of laying down on the job.
Touche.
I think we should end on that note.
Touche. All right. That is the show for today. I certainly appreciate everybody. Hopefully this was, if nothing else, entertaining. If not informational. So in any event, thank you again to our Patreon sponsors. Please do subscribe to our YouTube channel. That would be amazing. And once again, like, there's absolutely no harm in going to one of our playlists and just hitting play and let it play while you're sleeping. Like, or
do it to your enemy.
Or do it to your enemy too. That is true. Like, if you got people like tied up in your basement, like some of us do, like, you can play for them.
CIA uses the black sites all the time.
It's true. Which reminds me, that contract is coming up for renewal. Anyway, that's a whole separate discussion. So anyway, where can people find you if they would like to talk to you?
I am on both X and Infosec.exchange, which is your Mastodon server that you run out of the goodness of your heart. With the same handle, Lerg, Lerg. Find me there if you like.
Fascinating. It's a Infosec that exchange, just an amazing place. Just like Tahiti. Anyway, you can just like Tahiti. You can find me on primarily on Mastodon. It's infosec.exchange, and my name there is @Jerry. And with that, we will talk again next week. I hope you all have a lovely weekend and take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.